The doctors kept screaming when they saw what was inside the belly of the 9-month pregnant mother. Hello, everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch. The ambulance siren blared through the night. Inside the vehicle, Helen was in excruciating pain, her trembling hands gripping the bedrail tightly. Uncontrollable groans escaped her lips. Cold sweat trickled down her forehead, mixing with tears of agony. Beside her, Louis, her husband, looked deeply concerned. He leaned down, grasping her hand, his voice filled with faint care. Hang in there, my love. We're almost at the hospital. Everything will be fine. Helen clenched her teeth, sensing something was wrong. This wasn't normal labor pain. Her belly felt like something was thrashing violently inside. Something not like a normal baby, but something else. Something more intense. Something terrifying. Louis, something's not right, she struggled to say, her breath coming in ragged gasps. A fleeting cold glint crossed Louis's eyes, but he quickly masked it. He gently squeezed her hand, his tone soothing. Don't worry, you're just anxious. But Helen didn't believe him. Even through her overwhelming pain, she noticed the unusual expression on his face. Louis wasn't truly worried, he was only pretending. The ambulance screeched to a halt in front of the hospital. Immediately, Nurse Claire and a team of doctors rushed out to meet them. Claire, a seasoned nurse with neatly tied black hair, had a grave expression as she took in Helen's condition. Hurry, get her to the emergency room now, Claire commanded. Helen felt her body being lifted, the overhead lights flashing past in her blurred vision. The pain still gripped her, as if invisible claws were tearing her apart from the inside. As the medical team wheeled the gurney into the elevator, Claire turned to look at Louis. He stood there, hands tucked into his pockets, but his eyes were fixed on the clock on the wall. There was an odd kind of worry in his gaze. Not for his wife, but as if he was waiting for something to happen. Claire narrowed her eyes. Her instincts told her something was off. Dr. Roberts, a middle-aged man with graying hair, approached Helen's bed. He bent down to check her pulse and then glanced at the heart rate monitor. His expression gradually tensed. Her abdomen is showing abnormal contractions. We need an ultrasound immediately, he ordered. Another nurse, Andrew, quickly wheeled in the ultrasound machine. Dr. Roberts spread gel over Helen's taut belly and moved the probe across her skin. The moment the image appeared on the screen, the entire room fell silent. Dr. Roberts' eyes widened. Claire took an involuntary step back, her face paling. Andrew whispered, his voice trembling. What the hell is that? On the monitor, the thing inside Helen's womb didn't resemble a normal fetus. It wasn't still. It thrashed violently, its form distorted, unrecognizable as any human baby. Helen gasped for breath, panic rising as she took in the horrified expressions around her. Doctor, my baby, what's wrong with my baby? She pleaded. Dr. Roberts didn't answer immediately. He looked at Claire, then back at the monitor. Finally, he turned to the nurse. Prepare the operating room immediately. She cannot deliver this naturally. Claire nodded and rushed out. Outside, in the hallway, Louis stood alone, staring intently at his phone. He opened a text message, and immediately a line of words appeared on the screen. Everything is ready. Once the child is born, no one will know anything. A cold smile spread across Louis's lips. He swiftly deleted the message and slipped his phone back into his pocket. Helen was wheeled into the operating room. The doctors donned their protective gear, preparing scalpels and surgical instruments. Dr. Roberts took a deep breath and glanced at Claire. We have to be extremely careful. I've never seen a case like this before. Claire nodded. She looked at Helen, who had her eyes shut tight, sweat pouring down her face like rain. Just then, the operating room door swung open. Louis stepped inside, but Claire immediately raised a hand to block him. I'm sorry, you can't be in here. Louis frowned but didn't argue. He stepped back, clenching his fists tightly. Inside the operating room, the tension was suffocating. The heart monitor beeped incessantly. The doctors exchanged worried glances. Dr. Roberts held the scalpel, took another deep breath, and signaled, Begin. The scalpel cut into Helen's abdomen. Immediately, she let out a scream of unbearable, terrible pain. And then, a strange, unearthly wail echoed from inside her belly. The entire room froze. Claire stumbled backward. Andrew's mouth fell open in shock. Dr. Roberts stood motionless, his eyes widening in disbelief at what he was witnessing. From Helen's abdomen, something black, slick, and slimy began to crawl out. Helen gasped, struggling to turn her head downward. She felt something cold and wet slithering over her skin. "My baby," she weakly whispered, but no one answered. Outside the operating room, Lewis smiled. The surgical room had become a nightmarish horror. What emerged from Helen's belly was not a normal infant. Its skin was pale green, drenched in a viscous fluid, covered in a thin membranous layer. Its eyes were abnormally large and hollow, as if it had spent too long in the darkness. Claire stood frozen, her trembling hands gripping the surgical table. Andrew took a step back, his face drained of all color. Dr. Roberts was momentarily stunned before quickly raising his voice. "Stay calm. We need to control the situation." But no one could stay calm. A female nurse shrieked in terror and collapsed onto the floor. Helen lay there, gasping for breath, her vision blurring from exhaustion and pain. She couldn't see clearly, but she could feel something slithering against her skin. "My baby," she whispered again, her voice filled with desperation. No one dared to answer. Dr. Roberts tightened his grip on a pair of forceps, trying to steady himself. He turned to Claire, his voice firm yet unable to mask his tension. "We need to examine it immediately. Is this some kind of severe birth defect or something else?" Claire swallowed hard, her hands still shaking, but she forced herself to follow. "Orders." She grabbed a towel and cautiously moved closer to wipe away the thick fluid clinging to the creature's body. The moment she touched it, it convulsed violently, releasing a raspy, guttural sound, like the breath of something that had never belonged to this world. Andrew took another step back, sweat forming on his forehead. "What the hell is this?" Outside, the operating room, Lewis remained standing there, eerily calm. He didn't scream, didn't panic. In fact, the corners of his lips curled into a faint smirk. Another doctor, Matthew, hurried down the hallway, intending to enter the operating room. But Lewis stopped him. "You don't need to go in there," Lewis said, his voice chillingly composed. Matthew frowned, ready to protest. But when he looked into Lewis's deep, emotionless eyes, he hesitated. "You're her husband, aren't you? Don't you want to see what's happening?" Lewis smirked. "Everything is going exactly as expected." A shiver ran down Matthew's spine. There was something deeply wrong with this man. Inside the room, Claire continued wiping away the mucus-like fluid from the creature. And then she noticed something horrifying. It had no umbilical cord. Every newborn should have an umbilical cord, but this thing didn't. Claire's eyes widened, her hands clenching the towel tightly. She turned to Dr. Roberts, her voice shaking with fear. "Doctor, it doesn't have an umbilical cord." The air in the room turned ice cold. Dr. Roberts stared at the creature, his eyes widening in disbelief. He slowly stepped closer, carefully, examining it. And yes, there was no umbilical cord connecting it to Helen's body. This is impossible," he murmured. Helen, though utterly exhausted, heard every word. She struggled to turn her head, her tear-filled eyes locking onto Claire. What's happening?" Claire pressed her lips together, unable to bring herself to say the truth. But Helen had already sensed the terrifying reality. The baby was not hers. A cold dread tightened around her heart, making her chest feel hollow. No, this can't be," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. While the others were still paralyzed with shock, Claire quietly slipped out of the operating room. She couldn't process what she had just witnessed. There was no way a child could be born without an umbilical cord. She recalled how Lewis had been acting strangely from the very beginning. He didn't seem worried about his wife. He kept checking. The time. He received a cryptic message. Claire clenched her fists. She decided she had to find out everything about Lewis. Lewis left the hospital hallway and walked to a secluded corner, taking out his phone. He dialed a number he had memorized by heart. A man's voice answered. "How's the situation?" Lewis smirked. "It's been born." There was a brief silence on the other end before the man asked, "And the child?" Lewis chuckled coldly. "Did you really think I was going to raise it? Everything was arranged the moment it was born." The man on the phone let out a quiet, knowing laugh. "So you chose that option. Good. Keep it quiet. Don't let anyone find out." Lewis ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Dr. Roberts made up his mind. He couldn't allow Lewis to get near Helen again. He ordered hospital security to guard the room and prevent him from entering. When Claire returned, she lightly touched Dr. Roberts' arm and whispered, "I have a feeling Lewis is involved in this." Dr. Roberts' face darkened, and he nodded. "I think so too." He turned to Andrew. True. Check all of Helen's medical records. I want to know exactly what happened throughout her pregnancy. Andrew nodded and hurried off. Helen remained on the operating table, her eyelids slowly closing from exhaustion. Claire stepped closer, grasping her hand gently and whispering, I won't let this slide, Helen. She squeezed Helen's hand. Outside, Louis was still smirking. St. Mary's Hospital had never witnessed a birth as disturbing as this. A heavy atmosphere loomed over the entire operating room, where horror was still evident in the eyes of everyone present. Claire still couldn't come to terms with what she had seen. The baby, or rather the creature that had crawled out of Helen, had no umbilical cord. Its skin was sickly pale, its eyes were deep black voids, and it hadn't cried like a normal newborn. Dr. Roberts was the first to regain his composure. He turned to Claire, his voice tense but decisive. We need to isolate it immediately. Claire swallowed hard and reached for a clean towel to wrap around the creature. Though she tried to steady herself, her hands trembled as they made contact with its unnaturally cold skin. The moment the cloth covered its body, the small creature curled up, trembling as if it were afraid of the light. Andrew watched the scene unfold, a shiver running down his spine. Why is it reacting like that? He murmured. No one answered. Helen, still lying on the operating table, her eyelids barely open, weakly looked around. My baby. Where is my baby? Dr. Roberts clenched his fists, his gaze fixed on the creature wrapped in the cloth. He knew that no matter how he explained it, Helen would never be able to accept this truth. Claire lowered herself gently, taking Helen's hand, her voice trembling. Helen, we'll take care of your baby. Don't worry. But Helen wasn't stupid. Even in her weakened state, she caught the hesitation in Claire's voice. I want to see my baby. Claire froze. She didn't know what to do. Dr. Roberts exhaled quietly, then turned to Andrew. Take it to the special examination room. I'll report this to the hospital board. Andrew nodded, unable to hide his tension as he took the small creature from Claire's hands. The moment he held it against his chest, an icy sensation swept over him. It felt as if a strange energy had just passed through his body. He instinctively took a step back, nearly dropping it to the floor. Claire's face paled as she quickly moved to help Andrew steady the bundle. Careful, Andrew mumbled, his lips trembling slightly. It's not human. Dr. Roberts clenched his fists, his eyes fixed on the wrapped bundle in Andrew's arms. Take it away now. Outside, Louis remained unnervingly calm. He didn't knock. He didn't try to go inside. He simply stood there, arms crossed, occasionally glancing at his watch as if he were waiting for something. The operating room doors finally swung open. Andrew stepped out first, clutching the cloth-wrapped creature tightly to his chest. His face was pale, his forehead damp with sweat. Louis saw him, and the corners of his lips curled upward. He stepped forward, his voice carrying a chilling undertone. Let me see it. Andrew tensed, instinctively taking a step back. Who are you? Louis smirked and pulled a card from his pocket. Helen's husband, the child's father. Andrew bit his lip, then turned to Claire, who had just stepped out of the operating room. What should we do? Claire pressed her lips together, her gaze flickering toward Louis. She didn't trust him. Even though he was Helen's husband, his demeanor was nothing like that of a father welcoming his newborn child. Claire made her decision. I'm sorry, but according to hospital protocol, newborns must be examined before being handed over to family. Louis narrowed his eyes, his voice still calm but with an underlying sharpness. Are you suspecting me of something? Claire didn't blink. I'm just following procedure. Louis let out a quiet chuckle, but his eyes darkened. He knew he wouldn't be able to take it now. Taking a step back, he shrugged as if he didn't care. Fine, but I want to be informed of its condition as soon as the examination is complete. Claire nodded, but deep down she had already made up her mind. She would never let him touch that child again. As soon as Louis left, Claire immediately turned to Dr. Roberts. I don't trust him. Dr. Roberts sighed, rubbing his temples. Neither do I, but we need proof. Claire clenched her teeth, lowering her voice as she spoke quickly. I'll go through Helen's medical records. If Louis is involved, I'll find out. Dr. Roberts nodded slowly. Do it. But be careful. Claire gave him a firm nod before hurrying away. Louis stepped out of the hospital, pulled out his phone, and dialed an unknown number. A calm male voice answered on the other end. Is everything going according to plan? Louis smirked, his tone dripping with triumph. Almost. Just need to take care of the last piece. And the child? Lewis narrowed his eyes, his voice turning ice cold. It doesn't matter, as long as no one finds out what really happened. The voice on the other end chuckled softly. Good. Then finish your part. Lewis hung up, tilting his head back to gaze at the pitch-black sky. The smirk on his lips deepened. He knew everything was going exactly as planned. Inside the special isolation unit of St. Mary's Hospital, dim lights cast eerie shadows over Dr. Roberts' tense expression. He stood next to the incubator where the strange newborn lay. It did not cry. It did not move like a normal infant. Instead, its abnormally large eyes stared into space, as if it could see something that humans could not. Beside Dr. Roberts, Nurse Andrew still hadn't fully composed himself. He silently observed the being inside the incubator, trying to suppress the shivers running up his spine. "I've never seen anything like this before," Andrew mumbled. Dr. Roberts didn't respond. He reached for a stethoscope and bent down to check the creature's heartbeat, but there was none. His breath hitched, and he quickly glanced at the monitor. No signs of life. Yet, it was still staring at him. Andrew's face went pale. He turned to Dr. Roberts, his voice unsteady. "Doctor, is it even alive?" Roberts didn't answer right away. He stood frozen for a few seconds before whispering, "If it isn't alive, then why is it looking at us?" His words made the air in the room feel unbearably heavy. Andrew swallowed hard, lowering his gaze back to the creature's unblinking eyes, and then it blinked. Andrew immediately stumbled backward, nearly tripping over himself. Dr. Roberts clenched his fists. He knew this was no ordinary birth, and Lewis was definitely involved. Meanwhile, Claire was flipping through Helen's medical records. She had been a nurse for over 10 years, but she had never encountered a case as bizarre as this. As she opened Helen's file, her eyes darkened. Some of the documents seemed off. She noticed a prescription, but it wasn't from the hospital. It had Lewis's signature. Claire frowned, her heartbeat quickening as she read the name of the drug. Experimental inhibitor X29. She had never heard of this medication before. Biting her lip, Claire grabbed the document and rushed toward Dr. Roberts' office. Lewis remained in the hallway, his expression calm as if nothing had happened. He glanced down at his phone screen. The message from the unknown number was still there. "The plan continues. No one must know the truth." Lewis smirked and tapped the message, deleting all traces of it. Just then, a voice sounded from behind. Him. "What are you doing here?" He turned around to see Dr. Matthew watching him with suspicion. Lewis smirked, responding in a composed tone. "I'm just waiting for news about my wife and child." Matthew narrowed his eyes, unable to hide his doubt. "A husband whose wife is in critical condition. Yet you don't seem worried. Strange." Lewis chuckled softly, but his eyes darkened. "What exactly are you implying, Doctor?" Matthew shrugged, but he kept his gaze fixed on him. "You seem a little too calm." Lewis didn't reply. Instead, he casually slipped his hands into his pockets and took a step back, maintaining distance from Matthew. "If there's nothing else, I'll be going now." Matthew watched his retreating figure, unease settling in his chest. As Lewis prepared to leave, Dr. Roberts suddenly appeared in front of him, holding a folder of medical records along with a document Claire had just given him. "Lewis, we need to talk," Roberts said coldly, his voice devoid of politeness. Lewis frowned but didn't look surprised. "What is it?" Dr. Roberts raised the suspicious prescription. "Can you explain why your name is on this prescription?" Lewis froze for a split second but quickly recovered, offering a small smile and a shrug. "I only wanted to ensure my wife had a healthy pregnancy." Claire stepped forward, her voice firm and serious. "This isn't a normal drug. It's never been used in medical practice before." Lewis shrugged again, his tone indifferent. "I'm not a doctor. I just followed the advice of a specialist." Dr. Roberts narrowed his eyes. "What specialist?" Lewis scoffed and replied curtly, "You don't need to know." Roberts clenched his fists, his gaze turning icy. "I will be reporting this to the hospital board." This time, Lewis no longer appeared calm. He stepped closer, his voice dropping into a low, threatening tone. "I suggest you don't get too involved in this." Claire inhaled sharply, instinctively taking a step back. But Dr. Roberts didn't waver. "I'm a doctor. It's my duty to protect my patients." Lewis narrowed his eyes before suddenly smirking. "Is that so? Then I have my own ways too." He turned and walked away, leaving a tense atmosphere in his wake. As soon as he was gone, Claire turned to Dr. Roberts. "What should we do now?" Roberts exhaled, glancing down at the documents. I need more proof. But one thing is clear. Lewis is hiding something. Claire clenched her fists. I'll find out the truth. Meanwhile, Helen suddenly began convulsing. On the hospital bed, the heart monitor blared with urgent beeping. Nurses rushed in, trying to hold her down as her body thrashed violently. Inside Helen, something was still moving. The piercing sound of the heart monitor filled the intensive care room. The nurses panicked as they struggled to stabilize her. Dr. Roberts rushed to the bedside, his expression grave. He immediately checked her pulse. Her blood pressure is dropping fast. Prepare adrenaline now. Claire quickly pulled out a syringe and injected the medication directly into Helen's vein. Helen's body continued to convulse violently, her mouth gaping open, eyes wide in terror, as if something inside her was strangling her from within. Andrew held her arm tightly, his voice filled with alarm. She's completely losing control of her body! Dr. Roberts quickly turned on the ultrasound machine, moving the probe over Helen's abdomen, and then the entire room fell into dead silence. On the screen, inside Helen's womb, something was still moving. Claire's face went pale, her fingers gripping the edge of the bed tightly. This can't be happening. We already took it out. Cold sweat dripped down Dr. Roberts' forehead. He stared at the monitor, where a small shadowy figure twitched violently inside Helen's stomach. Andrew's voice wavered, his disbelief evident. Then what the hell was it that came out of her earlier? No one had an answer. Under Helen's stretched, rigid skin, something was still squirming. But this time, it wasn't quiet anymore. It was clawing at the inside of her abdomen. Outside, the hospital room, Lewis remained where he was, standing in the dimly lit hallway. He held his phone in one hand, silently watching everything unfold through the frosted glass. He knew the critical moment had arrived. Lewis dialed a familiar number. The phone rang only once before a voice answered. Speak. A deep, cold voice came from the other end. Lewis lowered his voice, his gaze fixed on the hospital room door. They've figured it out. But don't worry, I have a plan. The man on the line let out a low chuckle, though there was clear irritation in his tone. You assured me there wouldn't be any loose ends. Lewis smirked. I've never failed at cleaning up a mess. There was a pause before the voice responded, this time with a hint of warning. Handle it before it's too late. The call ended. The smirk faded from Lewis's lips. Inside the hospital room, Helen's body suddenly went rigid. The nurses froze. The air became eerily still. Claire quickly leaned over to check her. Her heart rate just dropped to 30. She's slipping into a coma. Dr. Roberts gripped Helen's wrist. Tightly, his eyes filled with urgency. We need to operate immediately. If we don't, she won't survive. There was no other choice. He turned to Andrew. Prepare the operating room. Call for additional surgeons now. Claire swallowed hard, knowing a life-or-death battle was about to begin. As she rushed out to help prepare for surgery, she suddenly found herself face-to-face with Lewis in the hallway. He stepped in front of her, blocking her path, his eyes as cold as ice. Where do you think you're going? Claire clenched her fists, refusing to back down. To save Helen and her real child. Lewis smirked, but this time his voice dripped with menace. I don't think so. Without warning, he grabbed Claire's wrist, squeezing it tightly. Pain shot up her arm, but she gritted her teeth and hissed, Let go of me! Lewis didn't move. You shouldn't interfere in this, Claire. Otherwise, you won't like the consequences. Claire glared at him, her fury burning through the pain. You can threaten me all you want, but I'm not afraid of you. I won't let Helen die. Lewis held her gaze for a long moment before unexpectedly releasing his grip. He stepped back, his eyes flashing with something dangerous. Then let's see who wins. Claire didn't hesitate any longer. She sprinted straight to the operating room, leaving Lewis behind with a chilling smile. Helen was rushed into surgery immediately. The doctors were prepared, but no one truly knew what they were about to find inside her. Dr. Roberts pulled on his surgical gloves, his voice tense as he glanced at the monitor. We're delivering the baby now. If anyone doesn't have the stomach for this, leave the room. No one moved. Claire clenched her fists. She knew this was the moment that would change everything. As the doctors prepared for the operation, Lewis took out his phone and dialed a special number. A familiar voice answered instantly. Is it handled? Lewis glanced toward the operating room, his smirk as cold as ice. I have a better plan. There was a brief silence on the other end before the man asked, What do you mean? Lewis chuckled darkly, lowering his voice. If they can't save Helen, then no one will ever know the truth. The man let out a low laugh. Good. But you know, there can be no mistakes. Lewis ended the call, his expression turning ruthless. Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. Inside the operating room, the scalpel was raised. The bright surgical lights reflected off Dr. Roberts' sweat-covered face. He stood beside the operating table, gripping the scalpel tightly, his eyes locked on Helen's abdomen, where something was still moving. Claire held her breath, her hands clasped together, trying to stay composed. Andrew stood next to her, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. His voice wavered with unease. Are we really doing this? We don't even know what's inside. Dr. Roberts took a deep breath, his voice dropping low. Whatever it is, we have to get it out. If we don't, Helen won't survive. Claire gave a firm nod, determination shining in her eyes. Let's do it. Outside. The operating room. Lewis stood in the shadows, pressing his phone tightly to his ear. Is everything in position? His voice was ice cold. The familiar voice replied on the other end. Our men are nearby. Say the word, and we cut the power to the entire area. Lewis smirked, his eyes gleaming with cruelty. Do it. I don't want them to finish that surgery. Understood. Lewis ended the call, slipping his phone into his pocket. He glanced at the clock, counting down the seconds in his mind. He knew in just a few moments everything would be plunged into darkness. Inside the operating room, everyone held their breath as Dr. Roberts placed the scalpel against Helen's abdomen. The heart monitor beeped rapidly, mirroring her critical condition. Roberts exchanged one last glance with Claire. We're starting now. The blade pressed down. The moment the first incision was made, a piercing scream echoed through the room. But it didn't come from Helen. It came from inside her. Claire shuddered. Andrew's face turned ghostly pale. Dr. Roberts abruptly froze, his eyes widening as something thrashed wildly beneath Helen's skin. And then, it scratched against the inside of her belly. A pale, slimy, blackened hand suddenly burst out of the incision. The entire operating room erupted in screams of horror. Claire staggered back, her hands trembling violently. What the hell is that? Andrew couldn't move. He was completely frozen in terror. The creature inside Helen thrashed violently, its slimy pale hand gripping the edges of the incision, pulling itself out. Dr. Roberts gritted his teeth, his voice filled with determination. We can't let it get out! He grabbed a surgical clamp and pressed it down on the writhing hand. But at that very moment, the hospital lost power. The entire area was plunged into darkness. Machines blared loudly. Doctors and nurses screamed, in panic. Claire spun toward the door, her voice laced with fear. What's happening? Andrew fumbled around, desperately searching for a flashlight. The emergency generator had yet to kick in. Dr. Roberts' expression darkened. He knew this wasn't a simple power failure. Someone had cut the electricity on purpose. Outside, Lewis stood calmly in the darkness. He watched as the hospital descended into chaos, and he smiled. Step 1 complete. Step 2 about to begin. Inside the operating room, Claire hurriedly switched on a flashlight. The dim beam of light illuminated the surgical table, and they saw something crawling out of Helen's abdomen. A creature with hollow black eyes and thin claw-like hands gripping the edge of the incision, pulling itself out into the darkness. Andrew stumbled backward, his voice breaking with horror. We have to do something. It's coming out. Claire took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but her heart was pounding violently. Dr. Roberts clenched the clamp tighter. He knew they couldn't let this thing escape. He looked at Claire, his voice low and firm. We have to stop it. Claire nodded sharply, determination flashing in her eyes. They couldn't let this thing survive. Outside, Lewis walked away, undetected, in the darkness. He pulled out his phone and sent one final message. Erase all traces. A response came immediately. Understood. Lewis slipped the phone back into his pocket and vanished into the night. Inside the operating room, Claire and Dr. Roberts braced for the final battle. They knew if they didn't stop this creature now, no one would survive. The dim flashlight beams illuminated their tense faces. Helen lay unconscious on the table, her face ghostly pale, her breaths weak. But the most horrifying thing was the thing that had crawled out of her womb. It wasn't human. Claire clenched her fists, her expression filled with fury. This isn't right. This thing is just a malformed sac. Everyone froze. Dr. Roberts quickly turned back to the ultrasound monitor. And then, the horrifying truth was revealed. Inside Helen's womb, a real baby was still there. Andrew's mouth fell open in disbelief. What does this mean? Dr. Roberts clenched his fists, his voice shaking with emotion. Helen still has a real baby. This thing isn't hers. It's just a parasitic twin. The operating room fell silent for a few seconds before shifting into an atmosphere filled with determination. Claire placed a hand over her chest, exhaling shakily, her eyes glistening with tears. That means we still have a chance to save Helen's baby. Dr. Roberts nodded firmly and immediately gave the order. We will remove the deformity and proceed with the emergency C-section right away. There was no hesitation. This was their final battle to fight for Helen's life and her child's survival. Outside the hospital, Lewis moved quickly down the hallway, his grip tightening around his phone. He knew things were beginning to spiral out of control. He pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number, but this time, no one answered. Lewis clenched his jaw, his eyes flashing with anger. Damn it! I can't let them find out the truth. He picked up his pace, heading toward the hospital exit. But at that moment, "Stop right there, Lewis!" A sharp voice cut through the air. Lewis froze and turned around. Right in front of him, a team of police officers blocked the exit. Standing at the center of them was Claire, her eyes blazing with fury and determination. "Lewis, did you really think you could escape?" Lewis pressed his lips together, trying to keep his composure. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just a husband worried about his wife." Claire let out a cold laugh, then held up a file of documents she had uncovered. "Then explain this. Why is your name on the prescription for a banned drug that Helen was given during her pregnancy?" Lewis's face went pale. Police Chief Ramsey, a seasoned officer with piercing eyes, stepped forward, locking his gaze onto Lewis. "Lewis Carter, you are under arrest for medical malpractice, intentionally endangering your wife and unborn child." Lewis took a deep breath, trying to mask his fear. "You have no proof." Claire smirked and took a step closer. "Oh, really? Then, would you like to hear the recording of your own words?" She pulled out her phone and played a secret recording she had captured from their earlier conversation. Lewis's voice echoed through the hallway. "If they can't save Helen, then no one will ever know the truth." The entire scene froze. Lewis's face drained of all color. Chief Ramsey didn't say another word. He simply gestured to the officers. Two policemen stepped forward and restrained Lewis on the spot. Lewis thrashed and yelled, "You can't do this to me! I'm her husband!" The officers ignored him, quickly snapping the handcuffs into place. "Take him away now!" Lewis was dragged off, screaming in rage and desperation. But no one cared about him anymore because, inside the operating room, a miracle was unfolding. Dr. Roberts carefully lowered his scalpel, preparing to perform the most important surgery of his life. Claire stood beside Helen, gently holding her weak hand, whispering, "Hold on, Helen. Your baby is almost here." Andrew wiped the sweat off his forehead, his voice thick with emotion. "I've never seen a birth this intense in my entire career." Dr. Roberts focused intensely, his eyes burning with determination. And then, a baby's cry echoed through the room. A strong, loud cry that filled the entire operating room. Claire choked up, tears rolling down her cheeks. Dr. Roberts lifted the newborn in his arms, his voice trembling with emotion. A healthy baby boy. Helen had given birth to her real child. Claire gently placed the baby in Helen's arms, whispering softly, "Helen, here's your son." Helen's eyes fluttered open. Though weak, she mustered the strength to lift her trembling arms and cradle her baby. Tears streamed down her face. "My love, I was so scared." The tiny baby wriggled, nuzzling against his mother's chest. His cries softened, as if he instinctively knew he was finally safe. Claire smiled through her tears. Andrew let out a deep breath of relief, and Dr. Roberts closed his eyes, silently telling himself that it was finally over. Outside, Lewis was being loaded into a police car. Inside, Helen held her son as the warm morning sun streamed through the hospital window. It was truly over. The gentle morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow on Helen's tired but joyful face. She held her son close, feeling the warmth of his tiny body as he stirred in her arms. Beside her, Claire sat down, her eyes still red from crying. "You did it, Helen. It's all over." Helen gave a weak smile, her eyes glistening with tears. "No, it wasn't me. It was all of you who saved us." Dr. Roberts stepped forward, relief evident in his gaze. "No one should ever go through what you endured. But now you have your son in your arms. He truly is a miracle." Helen looked down at her baby, her tears falling onto his soft skin. The tiny boy reached up, his delicate fingers brushing against his mother's cheek, as if sensing the endless love surrounding him. Claire wiped her own tears, her voice trembling with happiness. Nothing will ever separate you two again. But even as things were finally looking up, there was still one last thing to be done. At the Los Angeles Police Department, inside a dimly lit interrogation room, Lewis sat motionless. His hands were cuffed tightly to the table. His usual confidence was gone. His face was pale, his forehead slick with sweat. The door creaked open. Police Chief Ramsey stepped inside, followed by a young officer named James. Ramsey sat across from Lewis, his sharp gaze unrelenting. "Do you know why you're here?" Lewis swallowed hard, but forced himself to keep his voice steady. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just a misunderstood husband." Ramsey smirked, then tossed a thick stack of documents onto the table. "Good. Then let me refresh your memory." James opened the file, flipping through pages filled with evidence, reports, and incriminating documents exposing everything Lewis had done. Claire had worked tirelessly through the night to gather everything they needed. Lewis's face drained of color as he skimmed through the damning papers in front of him. Ramsey tapped his fingers on the table, his tone dark. "You authorized an illegal prescription for your wife without her knowledge." James followed up, his voice dripping with disgust. "You conspired to eliminate your own son to cover up an unauthorized experiment." Lewis clenched his fists, but he had no argument left. Ramsey continued, each word striking like a dagger. "You thought no one would uncover the truth. But you forgot one thing." Lewis gritted his teeth, his voice shaking. "What?" Ramsey leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "Helen is alive, and so is her son." Lewis's eyes widened in shock. His face turned ghostly pale. He had lost. 3 weeks later, the trial of Lewis Carter officially took place. The courtroom was packed with people, including Helen, Claire, Dr. Roberts, and Andrew. Helen held her son in her arms, sitting in the front row. Her gaze was calm, but filled with determination. Lewis was escorted into the courtroom, his hands still cuffed. The orange prison uniform made him look utterly pathetic. He looked around, his eyes meeting Helen's. For the first time in his life, Lewis felt true fear. The prosecutor stood up, his voice strong and unwavering. "The defendant, Lewis Carter, is charged with medical malpractice, conspiracy to sabotage the health of a pregnant woman and her unborn child, as well as tampering with medical evidence." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Helen lifted her head, staring straight at Lewis. Her voice was steady but powerful. "You tried to kill my child, but he defeated you." Lewis took a deep breath, but he couldn't hide the fear in his eyes. The evidence was overwhelming. After an hour of deliberation, the judge announced the final verdict. Lewis Carter is sentenced to 25 years in prison without parole. The entire courtroom erupted in a wave of relief. Lewis had lost everything. His head dropped, his life ending in despair. After the trial concluded, Helen carried her son out of the courthouse, taking a deep breath, savoring the fresh air. Claire walked beside her, smiling warmly. "You did it, Helen. Now, no one can ever hurt you or your son again." Helen looked down at her tiny son in her arms, tears of happiness rolling down her cheeks. "I promise, I will protect you for the rest of my life." The baby stirred slightly, his tiny fingers reaching out to grasp his mother's finger. Dr. Roberts stepped forward, his voice full of warmth. "You are stronger than anyone I have ever met, Helen. I believe that you and your son will have a bright future." Helen smiled, her eyes shining with resilience. She had overcome everything, and now, a new chapter in her life was truly beginning. 2 months after Lewis's sentencing, Helen and her son officially started a new life. The morning in Los Angeles was peaceful. Gentle sunlight streamed into the cozy apartment where Helen lived with her son. Holding her baby in her arms, Helen quietly gazed out onto the balcony. Claire walked in, carrying a bag of warm, freshly baked bread from the local bakery. "Good morning, Helen. Did you and the baby sleep well?" Helen smiled, looking down at her son, who was sleeping soundly in her embrace. "Yes. Now, every morning I wake up, I feel safe." Claire placed the bag of bread on the table and gently pulled out a chair, sitting beside Helen. "You deserve that, Helen. After everything you've been through." Helen took a deep breath, her eyes reflecting peace. "I never thought I could feel this way, but now I know I've escaped the darkness." Claire smiled gently, placing a reassuring hand on Helen's shoulder. "And you don't have to worry about Lewis anymore. He will never hurt anyone again. Helen nodded, knowing that justice had been served. While Helen embraced her peaceful new days, Louis was living in a true hell. Louis was in prison at Los Angeles Central Prison, a facility that held the most dangerous criminals. He was no longer a man of power, no longer someone who could control everything to his will. He was just another inmate, despised and forgotten. Sitting on the cold iron bed, his eyes stared blankly at the soulless concrete wall. Nightmares of Helen, his son, and everything he had done haunted him relentlessly. Every night, he jolted awake, cold sweat dripping down his spine. He knew he had lost everything. On a beautiful morning, Helen decided to visit St. Mary's Hospital to thank those who had helped her survive the nightmare. As she stepped inside, everyone greeted her with warm smiles. Dr. Roberts stood in the hallway, his eyes filled with warmth when he saw Helen. "Helen, it's so good to see you looking so well." Helen smiled, holding her son tightly in her arms. "Doctor, I don't even know how to thank you. If it weren't for you and Claire, my son and I wouldn't be here today." Dr. Roberts shook his head, his voice calm and reassuring. "You were the strongest one, Helen. You fought until the very end, to protect your child." Claire stood beside them, smiling with pride. "You are an incredible mother, Helen. You took back your life, and that's what matters most." Helen squeezed Claire's hand, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you, all of you. I will never forget this kindness." After leaving the hospital, Helen decided to start over. She found a stable job, rented a small but cozy apartment, and most importantly, she poured all her love into her son. With each passing day, she felt her heart growing lighter. She knew she had truly stepped out of the darkness. Louis continued to deteriorate in prison. He was isolated. No one wanted to associate with him. He couldn't stand the confinement, the suffocating silence that came with each night. One day he received a letter. The sender, Helen. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside, there was only one single sentence. "I forgive you, but you will never be a part of my life again." Louis froze. He read the words over and over again, unable to understand the feeling inside him. He had thought Helen would hate him forever, but instead, she had completely let him go. Louis let the letter slip from his fingers onto the cold floor, his eyes empty. He knew he had truly lost everything. That afternoon, Helen took her son for a walk in the park, where children were laughing and playing. She looked down at her child, the one she had fought so hard to protect, and smiled with pure happiness. Claire walked beside her, smiling. "Do you have any plans for the future, Helen?" Helen took a deep breath, her eyes filled with determination. "I'm going to live a beautiful life. No more fear, no more past holding me back. Just me and my son, moving forward together." Claire smiled and gently squeezed Helen's hand. "I believe you will." The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in a brilliant shade of orange. Helen lifted her son into her arms and kissed his forehead softly. "We will be happy, my love. I promise you." The little boy giggled, wrapping his tiny arms around his mother's neck, as if he understood her words. In the distance, the last rays of sunlight illuminated the path ahead of them. A new life had truly begun. Helen's story is a powerful testament to the resilience and strength of a mother. Despite being betrayed and thrust into danger, she fought with everything she had to protect her child. Justice always prevails, and villains like Louis ultimately face the consequences of their actions. This story is a reminder that the truth will always come to light, and that kindness and forgiveness allow people to move forward without being shackled by the past. Life may be full of challenges, but faith and love will always be the guiding light. If you enjoyed the story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.